journalist by day, really. It's kind of what I do full-time. So normally I get stuck writing about city council meetings. And it kind of eats into my writing about stuff I want to write about time. I've had kind of a piece I've been working on for probably about 7 or 8 years now about, I'm from New York, I lived in Boston for a while, and while up in Boston, I actually wound up spending a week at I spent a week in a detox unit in a Somerville hospital. I was 25, I was drinking quite a bit at the time, and I kind of, it's just where I landed, and I'm okay with that. It happens. And I started to write about it, on and off for the past 8 years, a longer piece I'm calling It's a Bitch Being a Vegan in Detox. I guess I kind of figured that, what writer doesn't have a detox story or an addiction story? But then I realized that not all of them probably have stories about how they accidentally befriend a Nazi in detox. So I kind of pulled that out, and when Jesse invited me down to do this, I fleshed it out a little bit. So this is sort of an excerpt from something. The thing that doctors don't tell you about entering a rehab facility is how similar it is to summer camp. You're told when to eat, when to take meds, when to sleep, and when to shower, and you're offered various programming, carefully planned by the hour, meant to enrich your life throughout the day, and the food is terrible. Time also moves both quickly and slowly at once, and, like children, friendships are established or shattered in an instant. Mark and I became fast friends during my week on the detox unit. I'd arrived before lunch on Monday, but was an unconscious, drooling mess after my first round of meds. Later that day, slightly more coherent and carrying my dinner tray, I saw Mark across the room. We locked eyes, and he indicated I should take the empty seat next to him. That's all it took. If they offered macrame classes, we would have traded friendship bracelets by the time we went to bed. He was about 15 years older than me, nearly 40, and our primary reason for bonding was because we were 2 of only 3 alcoholics there, and by far we were the youngest. The third drinker, Vincent, an 80-something who wore Coke bottle glasses and was practically deaf, never spoke to us. Besides, the clique of girls from West Roxbury High School, all there for opiate addictions, thought he was adorable and doted on him all day, so he rightfully wanted nothing to do with us. What happened to solidarity, Mark asked him one morning during breakfast. We alcoholics need to stick together. Vincent cupped his ear to indicate he couldn't understand, or maybe he just didn't want to. Not 5 minutes later, some pretty 18-year-old came over with his coffee just the way he liked it, cream, 2 sugars, and a plate of fresh fruit. Mark knew I was a writer, so throughout the day, when anyone said something particularly hilarious or moving or disgusting, he'd yell across the room, "Hey Tiff, chapter 4, over here." At night, while everyone else watched TV, Mark and I would sit in a corner and talk. We'd complain about our roommates a lot. His was a middle-aged Greek named Georgios, who had diabetes and couldn't walk. The rumor was that doctors were considering removing his right foot at the ankle, so he was wheeled around the unit, room to room, program to program by a nurse. Still, at night, somehow he was a sleepwalker. That first night, Mark woke up to find his bed empty. Without alerting any nurses, he found Georgios asleep in the common area, sitting at a table with a cup of coffee in his hand and the coffee machine running. Mark gently guided him back to bed, and every night he'd wake up and find Georgios somewhere new. Georgios had a thick accent, spoke in broken English, and, like many of us, was often groggy because of his medication. People could hardly ever understand him, but once, in a lucid moment, I heard him say loudly, and really without reason, "One time, I buy ounce of Coke, I have a million friends. Once Coke gone, no more friends." Lauren, a heroin addict, was my roommate. A repressed lesbian, she had the physique of a softball player and kept asking if I had a boyfriend. This was usually late at night, when the lights were off, and I'd pretend to be asleep. When I didn't respond, she'd tell me all about her boyfriend, turning to look at me now and again to see if I'd woken up and to gauge my reaction. During these conversations, Mark and I would also swap drinking stories, because what else are you going to do in a detox unit? And he told me he was impressed by my drinking problem. By the time I checked into the Somerville hospital, I was drinking nearly a liter of vodka a day. He said he initially made the unfair assumption that I didn't really have a problem and had been forced into detox by overzealous parents. But you're a real alcoholic, he said, 100%. His was a sad story, but I guess all the stories you'd hear in a detox unit are sad. He grew up in Southern California and was an avid surfer and skateboarder. He told me that as a 20-something he competed in some of the early X Games that were held there, and even placed in a few of the competitions. Only silver and bronze medals, he said modestly, no gold. Eventually he landed on the East Coast. He met a woman, they got married, and they had 2 children, both girls. The oldest at the time was 9. When I met him, he was a truck driver. He'd been to every state but North Dakota. A few months before he landed in that Somerville detox unit with me, his wife and kids had left him. In fact, his wife gave him an ultimatum: get clean or he couldn't see his daughters. He missed his kids. He knew he'd never reunite with his wife. When I met him, he hadn't drank in 2 days, and his hands shook, and his speech was stilted, and he stuttered. My own shaking lasted only the first couple of days. By the end of the week, his was as bad as the day we met. But he had 15 years of alcohol abuse on me. The day before I was discharged, my counselor, Bernie, told me 3 out of 4 people went back to using shortly after leaving detox or rehab. So really, the odds were not very good for anybody. Mark and I were released Friday afternoon and ran into each other in the hospital lobby. We hugged and exchanged phone numbers. We'd be sober buddies, we said. We'd go to AA meetings together, we said. We'd each be each other's anchor, we said. And we were, for a while. I'd go to work each day, come home, and then we'd call each other, convincing each other we could stay clean, we could stay sober. After 2 weeks, I'd had enough. Mark called one afternoon and I said, listen, you can join me if you want or not, but I'm going down to Red Bones. Red Bones was a barbecue joint 2 blocks from where I lived, with absolutely no vegan options. A fantastic jukebox, dark nooks where I could write, and cute waitresses who, for some reason, thought I was funny. More importantly, the beer was cheap. He agreed to meet me in a half hour. I got to the restaurant and waited out front for him, and I waited, and waited, and waited. He never showed up. He never picked up the phone. After an hour of calling, it didn't even ring anymore. It went straight to voicemail, and something felt very, very wrong. So I never went inside the bar. I just went home, and I went to bed, and it was maybe 8 o'clock at night. I called him nonstop once I woke up the next day. I took breaks every 15 minutes at work to call. His phone still didn't ring, and it continued to go right to voicemail. He finally called around 6 p.m. that day, about 24 hours after we first made plans. He apologized, and, rest assured, he had quite a harrowing tale for me. He'd been arrested, of course, locked up in the Tower, one of the jails in downtown Boston. He told me an armed robbery had taken place not far from where he lived, and the suspect drove the same car as him. Uh-huh, I said. I don't know how they could think it was me, he said. Uh-huh. I mean, they caught the guy who did it, a black guy. How could they mistake me for a black guy? I shrugged and nodded to myself because, yeah, Mark was pretty white. Incredibly pale, with a shock of dark hair and piercing blue eyes. I could see how he would not be mistaken for a black guy. He told me about his night in the Tower and said he was uncomfortable because they made him strip down to his boxers in front of the other inmates while they searched him. I always hated getting changed before gym class, so I understood his discomfort. He hesitated, then said, listen, I have something to tell you. Okay. He stammered and hesitated some more. I'm kind of a racist. Well, you know, my aunt is racist, my grandparents were racist, my mom can be a little racist. I think we all have somebody we love who is a little racist, and, well, I guess we still love them. We just lecture them and yell at them about their outdated ideals at holidays. I can work with racist, though I'm far from racist myself. He hemmed and hawed a bit more. Actually, I have something else to tell you. Okay. I'm kind of a Nazi. I inhaled deeply because this was very different from being a little racist. He told me more about growing up in California in the 1980s and how he fell into the Aryan race youth movement there. Some of his friends, he claimed, were the basis for the movie American History X. The reason he was so uncomfortable stripping down in jail wasn't because of body image issues, but because he was surrounded by inmates of different ethnicities. Some black, some Hispanic, and he had a large, dark swastika tattooed across his torso. He told me he spent time in a California prison for beating an African-American man to death. He said the man had broken into his mother's home, and he had chased this man from the house, down the block, eventually catching up with him and viciously beating him to death. He said when he got out of prison, he continued his involvement with his neo-Nazi gang, and a few years later, potentially facing more jail time, he left California. He moved to the East Coast, and he changed his name. He told me about curbing people in gruesome detail. He told me his brother owned property in upstate New York, not far from Woodstock, and implied there were bodies buried on the land. He asked me to leave Massachusetts with him and move to the West Coast, where his other brothers owned several houses and could put us up in a beach home. We can hit on women together, he said. I thought your kind wasn't such a big fan of LGBT folks. I'm okay with you, he said. I asked him how many people he had killed in his life. He paused and I could hear him mentally tallying the bodies. Do you really want to know? Would this make me legally complicit in a crime? I countered, but really I just didn't want to know. I was scared of him. He might have been lying about everything, or maybe just portions of what he told me, but I was still afraid, and I think rightfully so. So every time he called, I pretended everything was fine. I'd ask about his day, what he had for lunch, if he'd gone to a meeting, if he'd heard from his daughters. 3 weeks later, I accepted an editor position at a newspaper in the Hamptons and moved back home to Long Island. As I prepared to move, Mark talked about getting back to work driving trucks. He'd come visit me, he told me, if he didn't hate the Long Island Expressway so much. And I was kind of thankful for that one. I'd look at his name in my contact list. His calls continued for a while as I settled into my new job, and then nothing. Silence. I'd look at his name in my contact list and contemplate calling him, but I realized it was a clean break and knew I should keep it that way. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly I forgot about him. Work kept me busy. I saw family and friends often. I still sometimes drank, but certainly not a liter of vodka a day. It was fine to have a few beers every now and again, I told myself. Then nearly a year later, Mark called from an unknown number. He was in a rehab program in New Hampshire. He was calling from a payphone. He was getting his life together, he promised, as though I was emotionally invested in his recovery. And I was, because if, as my counselor said, only 1 in 4 people stays clean after a rehab program, and Mark was the one, where did that leave me? Also, if a Nazi was my benchmark for sobriety, my life couldn't possibly be as great as I told myself it was. Mark was allowed to receive calls at his rehab program now, and he told me to jot down a number. The next week, after a few beers, I dared myself to call him, but nobody picked up. The answering machine's outgoing message indicated I had called somebody's home, not a mental health facility. I called again, thinking I'd mistyped the number, but I got the same message. The man on the message sounded happy and cheery. Just leave a message for him, his wife, his son, his daughter, and they'd get back to you as soon as they could. This certainly wasn't Mark's home. Over the next few weeks, I called that number several more times, and nobody ever picked up. It was always that outgoing message. I never heard from Mark again after that, and, I do kind of wonder, where he is and what he's doing, and, honestly, if he's even alive, but it's really probably better that I don't know. So, anyway, that's it. Thank you so much.